You're listening to the Penteract Poetry Podcast, hosted by Anthony Etherin.
Hello, and welcome to our first podcast. In this series, I'll be interviewing poets and poetry publishers from all over the world about their craft and about the state of contemporary poetry. My first guest is Christian Book, the author of Eunoia and the winner of the 2002 Griffin Poetry Prize. I met up with Christian a few weeks ago and we talked about difficult poems, immortal poems, teaching poetry, and the fundamentally different approaches poets take towards composition. I began by asking him when he first became interested in being a poet.
I always knew that I would probably be a poet. I have an unusual origin story. When I was about 4 years old, I was taken to a shopping mall at Christmas to meet with Santa Claus for the first time in order to ask for my very first Christmas gift. And I didn't know what to expect on this occasion. I just thought it was quite miraculous that I could be escorted to this palace in a shopping mall and sit on the knee of, a rotund guy in a red suit, and he might grant me a wish. And at the very moment he asked me what I wanted for Christmas, I said, somewhat spontaneously, a typewriter. And I had, of course, no clue what a typewriter was. I really didn't know, but I had heard that word, and I'd asked for one promptly. And Santa Claus, to his credit, attempted to talk me out of this particular wish and asked me whether or not I would prefer to have a teddy bear or a jet or something else. And instead, I got frustrated with Santa Claus and expressed my outrage that he wouldn't offer me a typewriter. And to the credit of my working class parents, they actually purchased for me for Christmas a green plastic typewriter designed for children. And I got this machine on Christmas Day, and I was taught very quickly how to use it. And I promptly, scrolled a sheet of paper into the platen and opened up my favorite book, an encyclopedia of machines that my dad had on his shelf. I was a weird kid who really enjoyed this strange book that showed exploded views of ordinary devices like toasters and fire extinguishers and had an explanation of them beside these diagrams. And all I did was look at the glyphs on the page, these little shapes on the page, find the shape on the keyboard, and then hit the key. And even though I was illiterate, I couldn't read, I'm only 4 years old, I nevertheless would sit there for hours typing out pages from this encyclopedia of machines. And I would show each page to my mother and say, look, I'm a writer, because I had transcribed a page of written text from an encyclopedia. And I think that that's how I became a writer. Now, oddly enough, nearly 2 decades later, I ended up participating in the founding of an avant-garde literary movement in which we actually spend time retyping pages from books and publishing them as works of poetry. So I think that the origins of my life as a poet begin at that moment when I was given a green plastic typewriter for Christmas and proceeded to pretend that I was a writer by typing out glyphs and marks from what was at the time my favorite book. When I was at school, at university, in my undergraduate days, of course, I took classes in writing, and I was very responsible as a student. I did everything that the teacher told me to do, and I wrote poetry that was merely okay. It was mediocre lyric poetry. I could get the occasional poem published, but at the time I recognized that I wasn't going to be very good as a poet. And it was only until I entered graduate school and learned something about the history of the avant-garde in poetry that I think I came to my full fruition as a burgeoning poet. Because then I learned that I was attempting to become the kind of poet I should be, not the kind of poet I could be. And ever since, I've done my best to be the kind of poet I could be, rather than the kind of poet I should be. I think that that's the nature of avant-garde poetry in general. Try to be the poet you can be, rather than the one you must be, or have to be, because somebody tells you that that's how you have to be.
You've said in the past that people become poets, and you may not have put it exactly this way, but you've said that people become poets because they perhaps can't be anything else.
People who become poets get demoted to that job.
Yeah.
You become a poet because you are incapable of becoming something else. That if you actually had the capacity to be something else, you would do that instead, because it would be undoubtedly much more rewarding, a more exciting profession that would grant you greater honor and more reward. In my experience, poets have found themselves in the position of poet in part because they feel that they can't do anything else, and it becomes a kind of priestly calling that is the best reflection of their aptitudes, because they've, shall I say, failed at everything else. I mean, I think that I've become a poet in part because I failed at everything else.
But that's quite negative, isn't it?
Well,
I think
I'm being facetious. I think I'm remarking that there's something about poetry that seems absurd in as a choice of career. I'm always amazed that people imagine that they can make a productive life as a poet when there's so much evidence to the contrary.
But that's why it's amazing when somebody actually does make money from poetry, and more importantly, it acquires a fan base, and a fan base that isn't just other poets, which you have done.
My poetry made me money, yes. Very good supplementary income, and that by most modern standards, I'm among the most successful poets alive. But I'm far outclassed now by the likes of Rupi Kaur, who was most recently declared the poet of the decade, the poet of the 20-teens. And I'm very interested in her success, in part because it's so difficult to imagine any poet acquiring a small fortune. She must be a millionaire by now. She's certainly sold millions of copies of her books. She's outsold me, a fellow Canadian poet, by at least 2 orders of magnitude. And I think that that's a kind of avant-garde achievement, because so few people have probably accomplished it in the history of poetry. I've joked that Rupi Kaur is an avant-garde poet in part because, unlike most poets, she has made more money than you, right? She is, a gigantic success compared to most of us who are, by comparison, failures.
It's a remarkable story. There's a poet selling millions of books, and much of her success, if not all of it, is down to her use of social media, which is having a fascinating effect on poetry. I personally owe my own relatively very minor success to relentlessly posting poems on Twitter, although I don't know to what extent I'm realistically trying to become the constraint-based Rupi Kaur.
You're the constraint-based Rupi Kaur. Well, there may be some truth to that. I wish that there were millions of dollars that could fall upon you as a side effect of being so successful at social media. Certainly, the advent of social media has altered the landscape for success. That it's possible to route around many of the pathways to publication through the platforms available to everyone. And for that reason, I think it makes success a little more galling, if not difficult, because now everybody has access to the same tools to promote themselves, to achieve fame and glory, and there's no excuse now for not being able to do so other than your own inability, I think, to find an audience.
The poetry world seems to have a very uneasy relationship with social media. It's amazing to see how many poets have Twitter accounts but never tweet their poems. So they have an audience there, but no desire to take advantage of it.
I think that there's probably a split between those kinds of poets who are happy to publish their work on Twitter or on Instagram and enjoy the creation of an audience in response to it. I think that if you have a growing audience of people who are constantly joining your team of followers, who are taking an interest in your work, there's some incentive to satisfy demand by continually adding poetry to that forum. If, however, though, your work is relatively unrecognized, like no matter what you do, you still have the same follower count, you don't seem to be growing your audience very quickly, I suspect that there's some anxiety about publishing. And most people, I think, want to make sure that their work actually counts when it appears in print, when it shows up in the world. They want to see that it has had at least some modicum of impact. And for some poets, that might mean getting paid, right? They might want to see that there was some financial incentive that came with the publication. Now, I come from a clan of avant-garde poets who give everything away for free. I mean, some of us, of course, have gone on to much renown, in fact, worldwide renown, and some of us have even become bestsellers and have earned money by selling poetry, of all things. Nevertheless, all of us have given it away for free. We're probably the only avant-garde movement in the history of the avant-garde who have actually made our entire oeuvre available online for anybody to read or to download. And I think that that's unprecedented. The ability to make available work without mediation, without at least much mediation, I think that's an important innovation in the distribution of poetry. But it hasn't had much of a change, I think, in the way that people write poetry. Poets still write as though the internet and its social dynamics have not been invented. They still work as though this thing doesn't exist. And whereas Rupi Kaur, I think, has managed to figure out how to confabulate poetry in such a way that it would appeal to a broad audience within that milieu, right, within this platform. She's done something that I think provides permissions for others. It would be lovely to be able to recreate that formula. If you're a young poet, I could imagine, thinking that this would be a wonderful way to start a career.
Well, staying on the subject of Rupi Kaur, we know that social media has helped her to find fame. But that clearly doesn't explain it all, since not every poet with an Instagram account is famous. Is there some reason why the type of poetry she writes has become so popular that's completely independent of the platform on which people have seen it?
Well, let me put it this way. There's lots of poets who have complained about the merits of her poetry. And perhaps I'm among those who might not find a great deal of interest in it for myself. It doesn't, appeal to my taste necessarily. But I'm still impressed by the reach of it and the, kind of quantitative success of it, because that's difficult to achieve. And whatever formula she's managed to figure out to, acquire that kind of attention seems to me so far unreplicatable for a lot of people. And to me, I would just simply say that if people are complaining about the merits of the poetry, if they don't like the poetry, you might want to ask yourself why your own work goes unread, right? I mean, is it because your work is better or worse than hers? Is it because it fails to meet what might be regarded as a kind of poetic need among a potential readership? I think it's harder now to complain about the success of others when everybody has access to this platform and can figure out how to use it for their own benefit in whatever way seems suitable to them. I mean, it's one thing to complain about the success of others when there are lots of gatekeepers, when there is limited access to a limited number of poets and publishers, when your audience is highly constrained. There's no excuses, I think, now because of social media. If you haven't figured out how to, find favor with your audience, it's no longer the fault systemically of the audience or the restrictions and constraints of publication and distribution. I think now it has a lot more to say about the merits of your own achievement.
Whether we're talking social media or traditional media, one undeniable fact is that poetry is hard to sell. And in many ways, it's not just neglected, but it's not respected.
Yes, I love to requote a comment made by Charles Bernstein, who is himself requoting somebody else. My mentor, Charles Bernstein, once famously said that a blank sheet of paper with a poem written on it is worth less than a blank sheet of paper. And as cynical as that joke is, I think it's a funny thing to say, if only because obviously a blank sheet of paper has a tremendous amount of potential. You can use it for all kinds of things, including laundry lists and shopping lists, all of which are probably more important or more pragmatic use for a piece of paper than a poem. Again, I'm surprised that there are poets who imagine that the contribution that they can make to culture will matter simply by writing poetry, that it's possible to change the world or become famous in part because of what you say on a sheet of paper. It's evident that people would prefer, I think, to read stories and be given narratives about people, rather than to hear the expressive thoughts and meditative thinking out loud of a person who's probably not accomplished much, right? I mean, that's the weird thing, of course, is that poets themselves are people who have, I think, sociologically accomplished very little, right? And yet, nevertheless, think that they have much to say that would be an important contribution to culture. I mean, I've had some poets who say, I want to be a poet because I really have important insights. And yet I would say, well, if you have something that's so important to communicate to the world, if it's so earth-shattering and newsworthy, then the proper venue is a press conference, right? Not a poem. I mean, you put ideas and you write down things in poems so that they can be forgotten, right? They can be, dismissed or discarded without much attention, right? The audience for poetry is already pretty small. And the means by which we measure success are, I think, somewhat petty and tawdry. I'm considered a successful poet myself, and yet I've only published maybe over the course of my career something like 70,000 copies of books. My entire oeuvre is outclassed by the sales of somebody like Rupi Kaur or any other best-selling author. Right? And yet I'm considered an important personality because I've sold what would be, by most normative standards of poetry, a lot of books. And yet that's not a lot of sales, if you ask me. I mean, it's a small town, but not not
But you're the mayor.
An earth-shaking number of people. I just don't think it's a tremendous number of people.
Going back to what you said about poets feeling they have much to say, we both agree, I think, that there's an absurdity in trying to spread a political message through such a neglected art form. But to give poets credit, I think most poets know this, and yet you still get a lot of political poetry. And there must be a reason for the prevalence of political rhetoric in poems, other than delusions of its efficacy.
I think that we imagine that poetry is a place to go when you need to rejuvenate an otherwise desiccated language, a language that's been abused by power, a language that has undergone travesties of its meaning, and we look to poetry to resuscitate it, to reinvent it and make it new again, to enliven it from an otherwise moribund state. Whether or not a poem can have much impact upon the world of thought and culture, especially in times of political turmoil, seems to me unproven. Seamus Heaney once very famously said that no poem has ever stopped a tank. I think that that's an insightful thing to say, but I also think it neglects to imagine that that's because nobody's ever stacked the unsold backlist of Seamus Heaney in front of one, right? I mean, if you want to stop a tank, right, you just have to stack enough books in front of one. And there are lots of books of poetry, right? I mean, you could build a pretty big barricade out of the number of publications that go unsold. Poetry could probably stop a tank if it was all put in one spot. To me, my own avant-garde attitudes are around the nature of the form, that the job of the poet is to figure out what to do with language. It's a kind of alien technology that we barely understand, and poets, I think, attempt to reverse engineer it for human purposes, whatever that might be. We tend to imagine that a poem, that language is supposed to communicate things, communicate ideas, and help us to understand each other, and yet it doesn't do that very well, or at the very least, it does it in a cumbersome and inefficient way. And poetry seems to short-circuit some of that inefficiency, does something unusual and strange that undermines or subverts these normative functions of language. In some sense, I don't know what poetry's for. Every definition of poetry, I think, is correct because they say something insightful about what poetry could be for. But that's why I don't subscribe necessarily, I think, to any particular aesthetic attitudes around the purposes of poetry. And I'm skeptical of the political, import of poetry. I think that, politics should be in the service of poetry rather than the other way around. And it's fashionable to imagine right now that the job of a poem is to somehow uptake an activist agenda, to say something that needs to be said in the face of power. And I'm not so sure that that's the primary function of poetry. And certainly it seems to have undermined other functions that poetry could, to which poetry could be mobilized.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of the different ways that a poem can be written. Something you and I have discussed a lot in the past is the dichotomy or complementarity of negative capability and the egotistical sublime. Would you mind briefly explaining these terms?
These two ideas are important features of the Romantic moment in the history of poetry. I think that most poets, especially young poets, when they first start out, start from a romantic vantage. That all of us, no matter what our interests as poets, probably begin from some sort of romantic standpoint. Who doesn't want to be a romantic at heart in the world of poetry, especially if you're young? But I do think that when you choose to be a poet, you pick your weapons, you choose your weapons. And most poets, I think, end up going the path of Wordsworth, William Wordsworth. They choose the egotistical sublime. They think of poetry as a kind of cognitive form of expression in which the poet speaks on their own behalf, expressing their sentiments aloud, thinking out loud, recollecting emotion in tranquility, or finding some spontaneous outburst of feeling that is supposed to testify to the authenticity and sincerity of the poet's personae. And certainly that trajectory has a long tradition throughout the history of poetry, leading to all manner of confessional outpouring of feeling. But that's not the only route that you can take from the Romantic perspective. You could also, take up the position of John Keats, who suggested that the job of the poet is to adopt an attitude of negative capability, not to express the self so much as to negate the self and allow forces larger than the self to speak on their own behalf through the poet. So this is the model of the poet as a kind of oracular and visionary personality in the service to powers that are beyond them. And that is the trajectory that leads through the wandering, mazes of the avant-garde in the 20th century. I think that you get two channels, two kinds of poetry that owe a debt to the history of Romanticism. One of them is effectively lyrical in its attitudes, and the other is effectively non-lyrical in its attitudes. And there are analogies in the history of art. I think that if you're an artist after the 20th century, you pick your weapons, you choose to become somebody following in the footsteps of a Pablo Picasso. That would be your expressionist, version of artistic expression. You adopt the lamp of expression, or you choose Marcel Duchamp, and you pick up the mirror instead, right? And that, in the case of Pablo Picasso, I think we're indulging in a world of the egotistical sublime, whereas in the case of Marcel Duchamp, I think we're dealing in the world of negative capability. And I've noted now that in the history of poetry, certainly recently, there is something in the egotistical sublime that wants to wipe out negative capability, that regards negative capability as utter betrayal of poetic merits, that it's treacherous to the self, that it forestalls activism, that true political sentiment can only be expressed through the authenticity and sincerity of the individual psyche, that there is nothing that can be activated in negative capability except a kind of self-serving vision of art for its own sake. And in my case, I picked up negative capability, right? That's my weapon of choice, I think, not the egotistical sublime. I've typically preferred poetry that doesn't address the self, doesn't think out loud about itself, but instead performs other kinds of experiments, attempts to figure out what can be said, something that's not expressive so much as it is generative. That the job of poetry might be to make things possible rather than to say things sincerely. And I think that that's, a probably oversimplified kind of dichotomy in the history of writing, but one that characterizes much of the ongoing controversies in the world of poetry.
Well, let's get to those controversies. Why does the egotistical sublime want to wipe out negative capability? And specifically, why now?
Well, that's a good question. I imagine there's many reasons. They probably vary over the course of history. If you imagine that a poem, that its job is to testify, then obviously being able to speak a truth on behalf of an otherwise marginal experience probably has power and advantage. People want to know that their voice counts. That's certainly, I think, implicit in the idea of the egotistical sublime, that every voice counts, that everybody speaks from a position of authority about their own experience, and that they can testify to it. That there's value, I suppose, in confession. And of course, there's an investment, I think, in selfhood embodied in that thinks that the truth can only be found through the avenues of sincerity, through the avenues of authentic expression. There's less notion, though, that fundamentally language is something foreign to us, and that we shouldn't speak on our own behalf, that we actually shouldn't adopt our own voice because that's what we already know, and that the job of poetry is actually to make discoveries, to generate, as I said, possibilities, to figure out what language could do if it was freed from the necessity to mean things, to say things that make sense. If the job of a poem suddenly becomes to make music, or to provide a lovely artifact, that's pretty to look at, pretty to hear, but says nothing. There's some, I think, model of treachery in all of that, because it doesn't privilege experience. And experience is something that people, I think, value. They don't want to see themselves denied, right? They equate that with themselves being silenced or marginalized or bracketed, when in fact it could be that you have to get out of your own way, right? That you may have to imagine being somebody else. Like, what's marvelous, I think, about literature is that people are obliged, at least in the best literature, to be something else, to imagine themselves in experiences that are not their own, to not write what they know, in effect. In most creative writing classes, we're told to write what we know, and I would caution poets to do that, if only because poets don't know much, right? They're not physicists or astronauts or business people. They're not billionaires. They haven't accomplished a lot, and yet they demand that we express what we know. And it seems to me that if we were to examine the human condition very carefully, we would say that while we might think we know a lot, we actually don't know very much, and that the job of the poet is to figure out what we could say rather than what we already know how to say. But I'm not dissing William Wordsworth and his legacy. I don't think. I think there's lots of cause to celebrate the lyric voice. It's just that it's the dominant one, and because it's dominant, it tends to suppress other competing varieties of expression.
Of course, the best way we have of determining truth is science, and science does whatever it possibly can to ignore the subjective voice, the subjective voices of scientists, even.
Well, I think that there's an element of the scientific at play in something like negative capability, only because it aspires to what 19th century novelists would have appreciated as objectivity. They would have looked upon experimental literature, what was called experimental literature at the time, as an objective assessment of human relations. And that required imagining yourself outside of yourself. It required, thinking about the material relations between people and attempting empathically to create convincing psychological profiles of people who are not ourselves. In addition, there's an experimental and speculative dimension to that kind of work, right? We suppress ourselves on behalf of forces larger than ourselves in order to find out what they might want to say. And in that case, I think that there's a kind of experimental attitude or speculative attitude that we see in those moments of science when it daydreams. So that there's something cool and objective, say, about the artwork of a Marcel Duchamp, right? That has the kind of sinister clarity of a flat mirror, and it has no affect. It seems emotionless, right? It appeals to an intellectual attitude in art. But by contrast, if we look at a work by Pablo Picasso, it's infused with a kind of human warmth that is illuminating and reassuring in its sensible attitudes, towards the world. It's not something that we're supposed to greet as alien and strange, right? It's something that greets us with recognition, right, as a kind of wonderful expression of the human concerns. So I think that in the history of poetry, there's just an attitude, one that is primarily humane in its understanding of language, and another that is, by comparison, somewhat more alien or strange in its understanding of language. Just simply greets the world as with a detachment, right? Rather than engagement.
I'm sure most people listening will have some familiarity with the Zenertext project, where you are actively combining science and art. So I hope you'd be happy, I'm sure you would be, talking about that for a little while. And also, if you would, something about the current state of the relationship between science and poetry.
The Xenotext is an ongoing experiment. I've been working on it since 2002, every day. And I have generated quite a lot of material as a side effect of this speculation. It requires me to write a short poem, very short poem, and then through a process of encipherment, I translate it into a sequence of genetic nucleotides. And then with the assistance of a laboratory, we build this gene in the lab and then implant it into the genome of a microbe, replacing part of its genetic code with my poem. So the organism now becomes the living embodiment of this text. Moreover, the organism can actually read this poem. It misinterprets it as a set of instructions for building a protein. And this protein, in its molecular structure, is itself an encipherment of a totally different poem. So in effect, I've genetically engineered a bacterium so that it can become not only an archive for storing my poem, it also becomes a machine for writing a poem in response. And while I've managed to get this project to work successfully in a colony of microbes, and I'm the first poet, the first person in the history of science to have actually gotten a microbe to do this. Ideally, I'd like to be able to get this project to work properly in an unkillable bacterium capable of surviving in all kinds of hostile environments. An organism that can survive even in the vacuum of outer space, can survive in nearly any kind of environment that you can imagine. And by putting my poem into this organism, I would effectively be writing a book that could conceivably outlast terrestrial civilization, and it might be on the planet Earth when the sun explodes. So in effect, I'm trying to write a book that lasts forever. And I'm, of course, responding to the socio-technological circumstances of the 21st century. I think that of all cultural activities, science is probably the most important, second only maybe to the economy in human activity. Certainly, our long-term survival as a species depends upon our ability to get the science right, to solve problems with scientific detachment and objective assessment of evidence and rational argument on behalf of these ideas that we learn. I think our ability to function within the universe really depends upon our ability to get the science right. And yet, despite enormous advances in the history of science, poetry does not spend much time thinking about it. And I lament, for example, that there are no canonical poems in the history of literature about something so important as the moon landing. Probably the greatest technological achievement of our species, probably of any living thing in the history of life upon the planet, one of the most important evolutionary events in life on Earth. And yet, there are no epic poems about this event. Nothing canonical, nothing worth remembering even 50 years after the staging of that expedition. So there's something in the history of poetry that greets science with much suspicion. Ever since, again, the Romantic era, there's a great deal of skepticism about the merits of science, and I think some anxiety that science as a discourse of truth has displaced poetry from its prior supremacy in that field, that we would count upon a poem to communicate the truth. Up until the Industrial Revolution, most truths were probably conveyed in the form of poems, right? If, like in the form, for example, of the Bible. We would go to a religious text to find what we would think of as a kind of cosmic truth about our condition. And, the Bible is a really beautiful book of poetry. But nowadays, the poem does not speak much truth. And most poets, I think, prefer to write about their personal experience, their divorces, even though there are robots on, the moon Titan taking photographs of orange ethane lakes, the most surreal kinds of environments that you can imagine, an absolutely wondrous, mythical milieu that goes ignored by poetry. I don't want to be one of those poets who ignore something so important. And, I think that lots of poets could address this particular discourse, because not many do, and it's new unskied snow, so to speak. There's lots of room for poets to make a contribution in that milieu, but it ranges very far outside the catechism of most people's literary training. You not only have to learn how to be a poet, you have to learn how to understand the discourse of science, and that too requires a great deal of expertise. Nevertheless, it's possible to do so, to bridge these two divides. And I'm a poet interested in bringing together radically disparate discourses, put them into conversation with each other, and hope that there's something that is generative as a side effect of it. Something unusual arises as a side effect of these experiments. I had to learn how to do all of this genetic engineering and proteomic engineering myself. I taught myself a whole battery of new skills in computer programming and genetic engineering that have proven to be useful and interesting skill sets as a poet. The project's still ongoing. I'm doing my best to get it to work in the target organism, but so far I haven't been able to hit all of the benchmarks for success. I've managed to hit many of them, and I've probably accomplished a lot more than many scientists and poets could do in my stead. Nevertheless, it's I'm hoping that I'll find a pathway to success.
Of course, in addition to being a poet, you teach poetry. How do you find younger poets respond to the idea of bringing more rules into their poetry, or to the idea that poetry has its own objective rules? Because it occurs to me that younger poets, in the grip of the egotistical sublime, would be extremely resistant to the idea.
Well, I do think that creativity can be taught. I also think that there are a set of almost mechanical rules that you can follow that will permit you to be competent as a poet, that there's in fact a handful of principles that always work and are part of the toolkit for getting good at something. What's unusual, I think, is that when you convey to poets who imagine that the purpose of a poem is to be authentic and sincere, they're surprised to learn that most of what makes a poem good has nothing to do with any of those attitudes. Right? That it's possible to say something amazing and wonderful and beautiful that outclasses, an inborn sentiment simply by doing something that is rule bound, that functions almost mechanically. I have to say, it's like the students are often surprised that it's possible to write something of merit by doing something that would seem so automatic. And I'm saying this about expressive work. I'm saying this about lyrical poetry. I'm not saying this about avant-garde work, which is, has its own set of procedural constraints and, forms of weirdness that can be taught. I'm actually really speaking about lyric poetry, that it's possible to follow rules of expression that always work. And part of, I think, learning how to be a poet is mastering that toolkit as quickly as you can, because it's a short route to success. It's actually, you get better by adopting these principles. And then, of course, you want your students to figure out how to apply them in a unique way. What I've learned about poetry in the course of teaching it for decades is that all poets write badly in exactly the same way. Every student who writes badly in the same way. They all seem to make collectively the same kinds of mistakes. There's a handful of recurrent errors that everybody who's terrible always make. They always make the same set of mistakes. But when people get good, when they overcome these handful of bad practices, when they get out of those terrible habits, they all write well in their own unique way. They become fantastically wonderful in their own unique way. Everybody, has an idiosyncratic pathway to success if they abandon these bad habits. What I would say I dislike about many contemporary creative writing programs, though, is that they've become so formulaic in their attitudes to the workshop that they end up eroding some of those idiosyncrasies of style and produce a relatively homogeneous clan of lyric voices. I mean, if on the one hand we're supposed to teach people to find their own voice, right? It's a cliche of pedagogy, and yet everybody who comes out of those programs sounds the same. They have many similar tics, many conventional habits that are not necessarily poor. They're just merely official. Like I would just say that they've become so normative that they're now boring, right? They don't contribute to the idiosyncrasies and uniquenesses of a person's form of expression.
One question I want to ask everybody who comes on this podcast is, how do you personally go about writing a poem? For example, I would pick a topic, say for example, the moon. Then I would choose a constraint or a set of constraints. For example, I might decide to write a palindrome, and then I put those two things together and see where the language leads me. Just see what happens. Of course, I appreciate that's not how everybody else does it. I imagine it's not how Rupi Kaur does it. We may never know. I don't think she'll come on this podcast.
What do you do?
Well, you should invite Rupi Kaur. I'd be curious to know how she writes. I would love to know how she composes her work. That would be very interesting because it's a successful formula for reaching an audience. Every poem is an experiment. I don't know what the outcome will be, and I don't know what I'm saying in the course of saying it. I'm trying to find out what will happen in the course of writing the poem. So I start with a series of experimental conditions. As you said I've got a topic, and I establish a set of procedural constraints, a series of compositional rules, and you follow them out of curiosity, just to see what might happen as a side effect of doing this. That's often why I write a poem. I don't know what I want to say, but I'm hopeful that in the act of following these sets of rules, I might say something interesting. And it's a surprise. Like, you hope that you will feel a sense of uncanniness by the outcome. So I've never set out to write a poem that will have a particular effect. I haven't said, I'm going to write a sad poem today about this experience. That would be atypical. I don't think I've ever really done that. Mostly I've come up with a really good idea, I think, for a procedure, for something I'm curious about, something that inspires speculation and interest. and I adopt it as a generative procedure. It's not an expressive attitude towards work. I'm curious about what might happen as a side effect of me adopting a principle, and then I follow the composition to its fruition and judge the result. Am I surprised by it? If I'm surprised and feel amazed by it, then it gets out into the world. Sometimes I will give myself a challenge that I know will be difficult. I want to test my athleticism, my virtuosity as a poet. So I might set for myself a really difficult task that I know will be unprecedented, very difficult, and I hope that I can accomplish it, as a stunt, to see, is it possible to, for language to be resilient enough, plastic enough to conform to this strange set of rules which have been imposed upon it. There's occasions when I've done that. I've tried to test my merits.
Oh, I've been there. It's very exciting when you start, and then you get about halfway through and you just want to kill yourself.
Well, I've written many poems where I've gotten halfway through or 3/4 of the way through and not known yet what the outcome will be, nor what nor whether or not it'd be possible, right, to actually finish the poem. I've gotten very far into a work with no hope that it might actually be completable. I still don't know if I can finish it. I have had occasions where I was writing a poem for someone, and it was written according to a whole variety of very difficult constraints. And the person was asking me, well, what's this poem about? And I said, I don't know. And she's going, well, you're down to the second last line. And I said, I still don't know what the poem's going to say. It's like watching a flower, germinate or unfold, right? I don't know what the actual bloom will really look like until it's fully unfolded, and I can't, in fact, say with much trustworthiness how it will finish. I don't even know if it can be finished, like if it will actually complete or not. And she found that rather odd, right? That I wouldn't know, even though I was very close to the finish. I understood that I was nearing the end of the poem and still didn't know what it was about. Still couldn't figure out what it was doing. It said I won't know probably until the last words on the page, what it actually says.
And this is true of your Zenertext poems, the Orpheus and Eurydice enciphered poems, which are very important to your entire project, yet you didn't know if you could actually do it or not, if it was possible to do it.
Yes, those two poems that I wrote for the Xenotext actually took about 4 years of effort to write. And I worked on no other poetry for 4 years. I worked on only those two little poems. The reason I spent so much time on them is just that they're written according to a whole variety of biochemical constraints that make saying something meaningful very difficult. And I'm proud of the works because I managed to discover them out of this rich potential. There was about 8 trillion different possibilities that I could explore, none of which generated anything but nonsense. And being able to find something meaningful in that welter of insensate statement was epiphanic for me. It was a big revelation to find these works. But I wouldn't encourage other poets to do something so stupid, to spend many years working on 2 poems just to prove that it might be possible to do it. It wasn't pleasant working on something for that long without much promise of success. And the reason I spent so much time on it is just that a lot of effort had already been invested in it. I had sunk a lot of money and time and effort already into the project, and I couldn't afford failure. I couldn't afford giving up. And I really wanted to be sure that the language wasn't capable of doing it. And as it turns out, my faith in the language has been rewarded frequently. At those moments when I thought for sure it's impossible, this particular task just cannot happen, I've managed to make it happen. So I'm proud of those achievements, those moments when I've felt that something was impossible and I've managed to accomplish it. I'd like to think I'm the poet who does impossible things. Who does something that nobody else is willing to do because it's already dismissed as simply impossible. It's just not conceivable that it could be done, and yet nevertheless I do it. And I hope that a career will testify to that kind of virtuosity. You can say, look, I'm the athlete, right? By contrast, right, I look upon your own work with much wonderment, right? There's a lot of witchcraft in your work because I can see that it would be extraordinarily difficult to do it, and yet you've done it with much aplomb, right? You've done it very quickly, right? Faster than I could do it, right? That's what amazes me about much of your work, for example.
Well, thank you. But this is about you. And so you have the encrypted poems with you.
Sure, I can read them aloud if you like.
Yes, please. And could you also explain the rules behind the poems?
Sure. When people ask me how these poems work, I say, imagine one of those cryptographic puzzles you see in a Sunday newspaper where you're given a coded message. And if you analyze the letter patterns and letter frequencies of this meaningless message, you could substitute for those letters alternate letters that produce a meaningful message that you can decipher this encrypted message. And I would solve these puzzles as a young kid out of curiosity. They were just a form of entertainment. But I wondered at the time why the designer of the puzzles didn't design them so that we would be given a meaningful message, something that made sense. But by analyzing the letter patterns and letter frequencies, we could substitute letters for those meaningful strings of letters and discover what the intended message was, what the encoded message was. So it would be like encoding a meaningful message in yet another meaningful message. Most codes, when we see them, are meaningless messages that encipher a meaningful message. I used to wonder, why wouldn't you imagine giving me a meaningful message that encodes an otherwise intended but alternate meaningful message? And what I've done here is something analogous to that. I understand now why it's so difficult to do that. Imagine pairing off all the letters of the alphabet so that they're mutually encoded to each other, so that if you were to assign A to T, you would assign T to A. If you assign N to H, you assign H to N. If you assign Y to E, you assign E to Y. Pair off all the letters so that they're mutually encoded. Now imagine that of all the possibilities, you can pick one. There's about 8 trillion different ciphers that conform to that constraint. Pick one of those 8 trillion ciphers, such that if you write a poem and then substitute the letters in your poem with the letters from your cipher, you produce another poem that also makes sense and is just as beautiful as the original. So that's effectively what I've done. I've written a poem that, through a substitution cipher, encodes yet another poem. And these two poems are mutually correlated. They refer to each other and are embedded within each other. I had to learn some computer programming to design a piece of software that would permit me to explore these 8 trillion possibilities. I had to come up with potential vocabularies from these ciphers and figure out if it was possible to say mutually meaningful sentences. And as it turns out, it's not very easy. It, in fact, is almost impossible. I spent years just trying to find even 2 phrases that would speak to each other sensibly. And it just so happens that after 4 years working through vocabularies that were pretty small, I think the largest vocabulary out of the 8 trillion ciphers that I could find had about 700 words, and it proved to be useless. I couldn't actually make anything out of it. So the particular poem I'm about to read actually was generated from a vocabulary that's only 120 some odd words long. It's not a very big vocabulary, but it was sufficiently robust enough for me to be able to say these 2 poems. And the first poem is entitled Orpheus. It's the poem written by me that gets enciphered into the bacterium. And it reads, "Any style of life is prim. Ooh, stay my lyre. With wily ploys moan the riff of any tune aloud. Moan now my fate. In fate we rely. My myth now is the word of life." Now the organism can actually read this poem. It understands this poem as a set of genetic instructions, and in response it builds a protein whose sequence of amino acids encipher the following poem, a poem that I've nicknamed Eurydice, a poem in dialogue with the original. So this is the poem that would be written by the organism in response to my text. And the poem Eurydice reads, "The fairy is rosy of glow. In fate we rely. Moan more grief with any loss. Any loss is the achy trick. With him we stay. Ooh, stay, my lyre. We wean him of any milk. Any milk is rosy. Now, what's unusual about these two poems is simply that they are the only ones that can, I think, be generated from this constraint. And they conform to a style of poetry from the 15th and 16th century, in which a herd boy addresses a nymphette, and the nymphette rejects the advances of the herd boy, a kind of pastoral tradition of dialogue between two lovers. And hence the nicknames Orpheus and Eurydice. There's an infernal dimension to this work because they're being enciphered in an unkillable bacterium capable of surviving in all kinds of hellish environments. And the two works seem to allude to each other. The first is a kind of masculine statement about the artistic creation of life, and the second one is a kind of woebegone feminine statement about the artistic decreation of life. And I think there's a bit of uncanniness in this discovery. It's not immediately obvious that this would be the outcome of that constraint. I didn't expect these poems to be the result of this particular exercise. And yet, out of the 8 trillion worlds that I explored, these are the only poems that arise. And in some sense, that's what makes them interesting and fragile to me as works of art, that they're the only poems that exist out of 8 trillion possibilities. I've explored 8 trillion different worlds, and on only one world does poetry exist. There's only one world where you might find life. It says something, I think, about the kind of metaphorical fragility of our own existence in the cosmos, right? That there are trillions of potentially habitable worlds, and yet only one of them seems to bear life, so as we know it, so far as we know.
It's always wonderful to discover these things, these happy coincidences that just jump out of the language. The uncanny is so important to constraint-based poetry and all experimental poetry.
You're hoping to solicit the uncanny. There has to be a kind of oracular dimension to the work, a spookiness, if you like, that arises as a side effect of it. That's the kind of value in native capability, that it results in a kind of spookiness. That's a totally different, artistic value, from authenticity or sincerity. Those are different. It's not that they discounts those ones. It's just that the standards of success are different. The poem is good because it instilled in you this sense of weirdness, of the uncanny.
And fun. It's so much fun.
Well, you hope that it's fun. I mean, you also hope that that you take pleasure in that experience, right? That there's something that amuses you as a side effect of it.
So finally, what are you working on now? The Zenertext is, of course, ongoing.
It's always the Xenotext. I have other, kind of subsidiary projects that are always on the go. They're minor achievements, but the major task is still the Xenotext. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to continue to accumulate resources necessary for me to continue doing the experiment. I've been fallow lately because I've not been able to resecure access to a laboratory, where for about 5 or 6 years, a few years back, I had relatively consistent access to some expertise. That hasn't been the case lately, and as a consequence, I haven't been able to experiment with the constraint. I haven't been able to sit in a laboratory and actually build the thing. Whereas before I was able to, through trial and error, do some play, work on this in the laboratory. Nevertheless, I'm hoping that I can transcend some of these difficulties and hit these benchmarks of success that would make me feel that I've accomplished what I promised to do. And once that happens, then I can publish the remaining features of this work. I've already published half of it. Most of it is a kind of reflection upon the history of the precedents that inform my work, the things that have influenced this exercise. The forthcoming volume would be about the kind of futuristic implications of this work and how it might speak to the kind of science fiction horror of our future. I'm hoping that it will say something about our relationship to technology and contemplate our anxieties around our own extinction and the extinction of other species on the planet. at a moment when we have a big existential dilemma facing us. To me, those are kind of crucial concerns, and the poetry that I care about seems to address them pretty directly. Science features pretty prominently in the work. Certainly, invention and innovation and speculation feature prominently in the work that I like. It doesn't seem to presume in advance that it knows how the world should be, and its first priority is not so much political as it is aesthetic.
A great sentiment to end on. As always, wonderful to talk to you. I hope you'll come back and talk to us again.
Yes, of course. I'd be delighted to carry on our conversation and do so via podcast. It was a great pleasure to be able to talk about my work. I hope that your listeners appreciate the merits of our conversation. Thanks a lot for allowing me to be your first speaker.
To discover more, visit us at penteractpress.com.